Baby Mac here, and I'm going to do my own version of what's known as Mortified, or reading something from my old journals, writing. I did a parody of John Lennon's writing back when I was in my late teens, and the thing is, you won't understand it unless I read some of John Lennon's writing, unless of course you're familiar with it, which I assume a lot of people these days aren't. So for that purpose, I took out of the library in his own right, and you can see there I haven't removed the thing on the front as per the instructions, but you can see John Lennon and the writing beetle right there on the cover. So let me just make sure that this stays on, and I will read you a short section of John Lennon's book, which is what I was parodying. And the thing is that the section I'm going to read is a very short story called No Flies on Frank, which is arguably a short crime fiction story. So here we go. There were no flies on Frank that morning. Oh, let me warn you that there is some adult language coming up. If not now, later on. There were no flies on Frank that morning. After all, why not? He was a responsible citizen with a wife and child, wasn't he? It was a typical Frank morning, and with an agility that defies description, he leapt into the bathroom onto the scales. To his great herald, he discovered he was 12 inches more tall-heavy. He couldn't believe it, and his blood raised to his head, causing a mighty red coloring. I can't not believe this incredible fact of truth about my very body, which has not gained fat since mother begat me at childburn. Yes, yea, though I wart through the valley of thy shadowy hut, I will feel no Norman. What great qualm hath taken me thus into such a fatty hardbuckle? Again Frank looked down at the awful vision which clouded his eyes with fearful weight. 12 inches more heavy. Lo! But am I not more fatty than my brother Geoffrey, whose father Alec came from Kenneth, through Leslie's, who begat Arthur, son of Eric, by the house of Ronald and April, keepers of James of Newcastle, who ran Madeline at 2-1 by silver flour, 10-2, past Watrowat at 4/3 a pound. He journeyed downstairs crestfallen and defective, a great weight on his boulders. Not even his wife's battered face could raise a smile on poor Frank's head, who, as you know, had no flies on him. His wife, a former beauty queer, regarded him with a strange but burly look. "What ails thee, Frank?" she asked, stretching her prune. "You look dejected, if not informal," she addled. "'Tis nothing but wart I have gained, but 12 inches more tall-heavy than at the very clock of yesterday at this time. Am I not the most miserable of men? Suffer ye not to spake to me, or I might thrust you a mortal injury. I must traddle this trial alone." "Lo, Frank, thou hast smote me harshly with such grave talk. Am I to blame for this vast burden?" Frank looked sadly at his wife, forgetting for a moment the cause of his misery. Walking slowly but slowly toward her, he took his head in his hands, and with a few swift blows had clubbed her mercifully to the ground, dead. She shouldn't see me like this," he mumbled, "not all fat and on her 32nd birthday." Frank had to get his own breakfast that morning, and also on the following mornings. 2, or was it 3, weeks later, Frank awake again to find that there were still no flies on him. No flies on this Frank boy, he thought, but to his amazement there seemed to be a lot of flies on his wife, who was still lying about the kitchen floor. "I can't not partake of bread and that with her lying about the place," he thought aloud, writing as he spoke. "I must deliver her to her home where she will be made welcome." He gathered her in a small sack, for she was only 4'3", and headed for her rightful home. Frank knocked on the door of his wife's mother's house. She opened the door. "I've brought Marion home, Mrs. Sotherskill." He could never call her Mum. He opened the sack and placed Marion on the doorstep. "I'm not having all those flies in my house," shouted Mrs. Sotherskill, who was very house-proud, shutting the door. "She could have at least offered me a cup of tea," thought Frank, lifting the problem back on his boulders. Now that is an excerpt from In His Own Right by John Lennon. And just so you know, here's what he writes about himself. About the awful. I was bored on the 9th of October 1940, when I believed the nasties were still booming us, led by Madoff Heatlump, who only had one. Anyway, they didn't get me. I attended to various schools in Lidipaul and still didn't pass, much to my auntie's surprise. As a member of the most publified Beatles, my and FG and PG and R's records might seem funnier to some of you than this book, but as far as I'm conceived, this correction of short riddy is the most wonderfoul larf I've ever ready. God help and breed you all. Okay, that gives you an idea. So this is the parody I wrote. It's called A Neuter Dog in the Leaf, Reready by Jane Lemons. It was a neuter dog in the leaf of Sari Ann. Sari Ann was woken that morn by a barfing sound. As she riz from her bed, she very saw a very dog in her very next to the very window tree. "Yea, verily," she cried, as she jumped up onto Stubbs. "If only I could have that dog," she snide into her armpit. "Yet, as it were, Princeton did beat Harvard last yesterday, 20-1. Why did I say that? How do you talk in parentheses?" She had no time to wonder as she slid down the barn hoister like a half-crazed paraplegic. In the end, it turned out all righty, for the little mutton wore without fleas and nice to boot. Sari Ann were exorbitant with joy, saying, "So it famous is, gissen der blatt hands nissen now. I famous am, you famous are, he famous were, we famous famine fab for, fuck, fucker, fuckest." Her mother said, "Such language," and killed her on the spot, which wore the dog's name. What a larf. So that was my parody back in my late teens of good old John Lennon. And my first crime story, I suppose you could say. And you know you're old when you have a journal in a notebook like this. Yeah.